I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that reduces the risk and costs of cross-border transactions. As a board member, there are few better feelings than making a suggestion which adds quick material value to your organisation. I remember when one of our board members saved us $50,000 with a quick introduction to a group discount scheme for one of our key suppliers. I continue to feel grateful to this day. Alt21 can offer exactly this kind of quick win for board members. By using their foreign exchange and hedging services, you could reduce your company's costs by 90%. For a company that has just 10 million foreign exchange exposure through its revenues or cost base, that could be over 300,000 back into the business. Alt21 are so confident that they offer the best value in the market. They show you how much they make from fees in real time before and after any transaction. If you want to save your organisation money on its foreign exchange and hedging, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Neural. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Gerry Brown, is chair of both Novaquest Capital Management, a global private equity firm, and of G. Brown Associates, a family company. He has held a variety of chair and independent director positions in public and private companies for private equity investors like 3i and Phoenix Equity across different sectors and geographies. He is a council member of the University of Exeter, where he has been awarded an honorary doctorate in laws, visiting fellow at Henley Business School and fellow of the Institute of Directors. Gerry also sits on the advisory board for corporate governance. He is the author and co-author of several books on governance, including Disaster in the Boardroom with Randall S. Peterson, The Independent Director, and The Independent Director in Society, amongst others. Gerry, a huge welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Gerry, in Disaster in the Boardroom, you reviewed and categorised into 12 groups a number of headline corporate scandals, which split between theft, fraud and bribery, privacy and data violations, sexual discrimination and harassment, tax evasion and avoidance, accounting irregularities, mis-selling and price fixing, abuse of market power, health and safety failures, labour abuses, environmental and social failures, collapses and bankruptcies, and executive pay abuses. When I reflect on the lessons from past Enter the Boardroom guest Dan Gardner in episode 85 around forecasting using base probabilities, that feels like a great checklist for board members to have as a starting point for their risk register. Is that how you think about those?
I think probably the answer to that is yes, but if I could just give a bit of background to why Randall and I wrote this book. In looking at board failures, we came to the conclusion that there are enough rules and regulations about how companies should be governed. For example, you've got the combined code for listed companies. Came to the conclusion that the issue is very much more about board behaviour. And that's why we set about categorising all these different types of scandals from all around the world, from all different types of sectors. And we think it's pretty comprehensive. It's not, of course, complete because, for example, the post office came along, which is a scandal in its own right. But to answer your question, we do believe that it would be a very useful checklist because almost whichever sector you're in, almost wherever you're doing business in the world, you can refer to our taxonomy and you can find examples of where scandals are happening.
And you suggest that behind these 12 groups of disasters, there are 6 archetypal board dysfunctions, and you give examples of each. So the subordinated board, where you look at Facebook, the imbalanced board, where you look at Google, the distended board, where you look at Uber, the bystander board, where you look at BP and Deepwater, the bureaucratic board, where you look at the big 4 accounting firms, and the conforming board, where you look at the example of RBS and Fred Goodwin. For those not familiar with those archetypes, can you just expand on how you think about those when you go into your board meetings and how you keep them front of mind?
If we take, first of all, the subordinated board and the Facebook example, really what we're looking at here is a board that's incapable, really, of acting independently of the executive. And this sometimes happens when the organisation has a dominant chief executive with a strong character. But sometimes it happens because of the way power within the organisation is structured. For example, if the chief executive is also a dominant shareholder, always got the power to control appointments to the board. And when this happens, it becomes hard, if not impossible, for the executive to be subject to proper scrutiny. And so in the case of Facebook, I think we're all familiar with Mark Zuckerberg, who wields enormous control over the company structure, despite the fact it's publicly owned, because of the Facebook dual class structure. Each share of Class A stock has one vote, whereas Zuckerberg holds Class B stock, where each share equals 10 votes. So this gives you the example of why it is that Facebook is able to behave in the way in which it does. The imbalanced board, and we took the example of Google here, and that's to do really with the phenomenon of missing key voices on the board. And if you don't have these, it's the inability of boards to listen to voices from inside the boardroom, but also outside of the boardroom. And the example, of course, in the case of Google was the fact that everything from widespread fraud to sexual harassment and abuse was going on almost under the noses of the board. And in 2017, the US Department of Labor, as part of an ongoing investigation, asserted that Google was engaged in systematic compensation disparities against women, pretty much across the entire. That would be an example of that.
It strikes me that you're always going to be missing some voices in the boardroom. You've got a finite number of seats and an infinite number of voices that you can and should be listening to. How do you strike that balance to ensure that as a board you're getting the signal rather than the noise?
This is very much to do with board diversity. And when we talk about board diversity, we're not just thinking about this from the point of view of having enough women on boards. And there's been a lot of attention to that over the years. And I think a lot of progress has been made. But also the whole issue of race as well, and having racial input and representation. And then, of course, age as well. Too often, I think, boards don't have enough young people on the board. And then you've got the whole issue of disability, which is particularly important, I would say, with some boards, particularly those to do with charities, for example. And then you've got the whole issue of what kind of representation you have on the board regarding technical expertise. And so often in the past, I think the board has been pretty well represented in terms of the whole finance area, inevitably, for lots of reasons. But to what extent, for example, are people represented on the board, and whether or not you should have employee representation is an interesting discussion, but at least have, an expert on people, because obviously you've got a REMCO to deal with, for instance, so you need somebody who can deal with that. So to me, it's about having this board diversity, and having and that board diversity emerging from having a proper process for looking to find the best people for the board, rather than just people being friends of the chief executive or the chair.
But what strikes me is that there are an infinite number of dimensions of that diversity, not just demographics, sort of socioeconomic, talked about disability, age, gender, etc., but also lived experience and functional expertise. And when you've only got, say, on the average board, 6 seats, you can't fit them all in. One of the initiatives that we've been working on, which I'm most excited about, is this concept that we call pop-up boards, where we allow CEOs or board members to put together a group for a specific discussion topic that they source from the New Role Network, and give them a sort of forum to discuss and explore their ideas and test their ideas, so that they're bringing in voices from outside the boardroom. What's interesting to me about that is there's a portion of people who absolutely love it and are getting huge value out of it, and then others who feel deeply uncomfortable with bringing in outsiders into topics that they see as entirely the domain of the board, and they don't like the idea that someone else might have discussed it before. How do you think about bringing outside voices into the boardroom?
I'm a strong believer in this, and when I chaired a medical device company, one of the things that we regularly did, particularly on visits to the US, because the US have got much more of an open mind when it comes to new medical devices, and we developed a new medical device. We invited experts to come along and talk to the board about the marketplace in particular for the device which we had and how best to really promote it. And I think that getting that kind of expertise from around the world is an extremely valuable way, really, of dealing with the issue of how do you become a more global business. You obviously can't have representation on the board from people from all around the world. That's clearly not even sensible or practical to even think about. But having experts that you can call upon. But the board's got to be open to that, you see. And fascinating, because I was on the board of the first management buyout in Japan, which is Vantec, was a management buyout from Nissan. And the chairman, I represented 3i, the private equity fund, and the chairman, who's Japanese, came from a long-standing Japanese family, insisted that I was available to advise and speak to the executive team on a regular basis about a variety of different issues which the company was seeking to come to terms with. So he was very open-minded about using independent board members to be involved with the executive team. It's about mentality. If you can have a learning organisation, the business is really about how do you learn from what's going on around the world in the most effective way, then that really is a way of dealing with this particular issue. But of course, you're quite right that some colleagues are afraid to do that.
Well, let's go back to the 6 archetypes, because I think it's so important that people have these mental models in their heads, because it will increase the chances that they spot them when they happen. So we've talked about the subordinated board and the imbalanced board. What about the distended board, where you looked at Uber as an example?
Yes, well, here we got, I would say, in business as in sport and many other human endeavours, a certain level of ambition and aggression can be a very good thing. I think it's especially true in startup organisations which need to force their way into the market, establish a position quickly. And looking at the history of most successful organisations, we can see how ambitious leaders with a strong vision played a key role in getting the venture off the ground. The problem comes when the vision begins to fade and ambition and aggression take over and become not a means to an end, but the end themselves. And this is what we mean by amplification of culture, the distortion of the original healthy, vibrant culture into something much darker and malign. And Uber, of course, is a classic instance of this. In fact, many examples of Uber really pushing the boundaries to breaking point and beyond. And so then the culture of aggression becomes amplified to the point where the company's aggressive tendencies encourage other forms of behaviour. And they led Uber to break some moral and ethical limits with consequent damage to its reputation. I think we're all familiar with Uber, and so we could think of countless examples, if you like, of the way in which that company is behaving, I would say, badly. But what we identified was that in terms of board behaviour, the issue of having the startup culture when you become a much bigger organisation, you really do have to change and adapt. And I think that's the case with many companies that, for example, become listed on the stock market but don't change their behaviour. And I've got a wonderful example, because one of the first roles I carried out as an independent board member was with a company called Tech, who were a business concerned with hardware and software. They became a very successful business, listed on the stock market. But I wasn't the chairman at that time. I was the deputy chairman. The chairman would ring me up almost every day to say, these guys are completely out of control. They want to carry on running this company as if it was a private company rather than it being listed on the stock market. He said, I really can't cope with this. And he was an experienced banker. And so he resigned. And suddenly I had to become chair of this business and deal with these two guys who just wanted to carry on. The way I characterised it was if they were it was almost as if they were in a sweet shop and they wanted to try and do everything. So they wanted, for example, to expand around the world into all different kind of countries. They wanted to expand their product offer into IT training and reverse logistics and all kind of other aspects of that business. They wanted to do all of this almost at the same time, which clearly was a recipe for disaster, but they wouldn't listen to the chairman who resigned because he'd had enough. He was well used to disciplined companies, listed companies, and these two guys just wanted to do their own thing. And that, to me, is a great example. They were a great example. They were excellent when it came to a startup. That's why they were able to list on the stock market. But then they didn't change their behaviour.
So let's move to the last three archetypes, and I think they're perhaps more self-explanatory than the first three. So the bystander board, where you gave the example of BP in Deepwater, where the board just stood back and initially blamed Transocean and didn't do anything, didn't get involved. There's that feeling of inertia. The bureaucratic board, where you give the example of the Big Four, where they're just so tied up in rules and processes that they don't actually engage with the key issues. And then lastly, the conforming board, with the example you gave of RBS, where they were just in awe of Fred Goodwin and nobody actually able to deviate from his momentum and path. Some of these archetypes, those six, more prevalent than others in your mind?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, very often companies, of course, or boards, I would say, it's a mixture of these different behaviours. It's not just one. And that is very often the case, I would say. And if one looks, for instance, at, the biggest scandal of all, as far as I'm concerned, is the Royal Bank of Scotland. Because, it's cost the taxpayer 60 billion. The size, really, of the cost to the community. It's not just the fact you've got a company here which, obviously, the shareholders were very badly affected. Thousands of people were made redundant. But it's also the community as a whole, i.e. us as taxpayers, that have really suffered from this particular scandal. And here you've got examples, particularly of a chief executive who was out of control, i.e. he and the executive didn't really pay too much attention to the independent directors and to the chairman. So you've got that. But also they didn't really have any strong voices, even within the executive team, I would say. For example, the ABN AMRO acquisition, which is what caused the collapse of Royal Bank of Scotland, they hardly did any due diligence at all. You would say if you've got a good finance director and a very strong finance director in a business, he at least would have insisted on that happening. So I think the missing voices thing in the case of Fred the Shred was very important, but I also think the lack of independence, of strong independence of the independent directors, they were completely ineffective. As to why they was ineffective is a very interesting question. And we could argue that, the chair came from the pharmaceutical industry, so he didn't have too much knowledge or understanding about banking. I think certainly part of the problem was that the independent directors didn't have enough expertise of the sector to really be able to challenge Fred, who had this mission of building the biggest bank in the world. That's what he was about.
All the examples you've given are big corporates. For someone listening to this who's a board member and maybe an SME or a charity or a mid-sized company, do they have any relevance to those board members?
I would say all of these examples apply, whether or not it's a big company, a startup, a medium-sized company. One of my books is about sporting organisations. It's about university governance. It's about the National Health Service, sports and charities. And when we looked at the causes for the scandals that happen in those organisations, you see the same type of behaviour going on. It's not to do necessarily, I mean, I'm thinking of university. I've been a council member of the University of Exeter. It's not necessarily always to do with the number or even the breadth of people around the board. It's more a case of, are they prepared to stand up and express their point of view and to really question what's going on? And to do that, you really do need to understand and have expertise about whatever organisation it is that you're involved in. But to answer your question, I think that these behaviours are generic.
Why do so many talented people get caught up in these dysfunctional situations? It can't just be a question of competence. There must be some systemic issue.
It's to do with power, to be frank. I mean, if you think of Fred the Shred, very competent guy, very able guy, no question about that, very experienced guy. But he wanted to control the board, and he had this mission for the RBS to be the biggest bank in the world, and almost nothing was going to stop that.
Right, but he had a bunch of talented people on that board who were, high achieving and powerful in their own right. How is it that they failed to deal with the situation?
Why didn't they challenge him?
And why does it keep happening? Not in that specific instance, but the fact that it keeps happening. For someone listening to this who thinks, well, that would never happen to me because, I'm much more switched on than that. But that to me seems too glib a response. There's got to be a more systemic issue here that we need to tackle.
It's the easy thing to do, to join a board and actually to go along with what the main consensus is of what should be happening. And especially if you're a new board member, then you might be concerned to even express a point of view until you get to understand what's going on. And so oftentimes I think it's a case of people not, as human nature, they want to rock the boat. It's difficult and unpopular, especially if you've got a very strong, successful chief executive to challenge what's going on there. And I'll give a classic instance, an example here. I was at university with Dennis Gillings, who founded Quintiles, biggest company in the world, concerned with clinical trials. And he was extremely successful man. I would say, to challenge him in a board, even somebody, I know him extremely well. I wouldn't do that. I would challenge him outside the board in that particular case, because he would find it very difficult to handle, having, lots of difficult questions fired at him when he'd been so successful. That's the fact. Obviously, if a company is less successful, it's far easier to be asking all the difficult questions. But when it's successful, it'd be pretty brave to take on the chief executive when he can point to his tremendous track record of what he's done.
So one of the things that I've seen be very effective, we have in our New Role Plus community a monthly meetup where board members can come and share issues that they're wrestling with a group of peers who are not involved in their board, who will then ask them questions and challenge them and share their experiences that they think might be relevant. And what I see from that often is people who go away with added courage to go and challenge, because they've sort of tackled the issue outside of the boardroom. I'm curious to hear, what advice would you give to a board member listening to this who recognizes difficulty of challenging in the boardroom when you're new and you have a successful CEO? What do you do, and what advice would you give to them?
The advice I would give them, first of all, is to understand the organisation and the business and spend time visiting, I describe it as the operations of the organisation. Because my background was in operations, I became the operations director. of DHL, I placed a lot of importance on visiting different parts of the company to really understand what's going on. Now, that's not so easy, strange as it may seem. If you're an independent board member, I joined the board of Keller PLC, who are the biggest company in the world doing ground engineering. And I said to the chairman, I'm going to be in the US next week with Quintiles. I'd like to visit our business there, our operations there. He said to me, that is not usual. That is not usual. We don't, our independent board members don't normally visit the operations of our companies going on around the world. And I said to him, well, if you don't mind, I would like to pay a visit. I did pay a visit. I spent 2 days visiting this subsidiary. It was down in Florida. And this subsidiary was not doing particularly well, as it happened. And so when I came back and we had a board discussion, this topic of this business came up. And I was able to say to the chairman and the board, look, I've paid a visit to this company. I've seen what's going on. This is my take of the problems that we've got and what we've got to do about it. And from then on, interestingly, the chairman was convinced. He said, well, in future, I'm quite happy then. We'll pay more visits to different. But, there we are. So I think my advice with anyone is really have to understand the business and what's going on. Universities, for example, are a classic instance. I mean, universities are very complicated business. Exeter, for example, turnover over 600 million. Very complicated business, universities are. And oftentimes, council members don't even visit the faculties. So I would visit the medical school, I would visit the business school, and I would make sure I had a presentation about what the issues are, what was going on, and so on and so forth. So I really do think the best advice I can give is that, because then you can add value.
I really like that. If I play with that back, what I'm hearing there is just saying, go get boots on the ground so that you're really sure of your facts, because that will then give you the courage to challenge. Because if you're asking questions and you're not sure of the facts, then you're easily going to get deflected if someone doesn't want to answer those questions. Whereas if you've been on the ground, you're sure of those facts, you will have the certainty that it's something that you need to keep pushing on.
Unfortunately, you see, so often people just read the papers for a board meeting. And what can you do? You've got to believe the papers. Whereas if you've been and visited and seen what's going on and you ask people, working in that subsidiary, for example, they would tell you. People are very open. I've always found very open about what's going on. But sometimes the only way to really know what's going on is to visit. I mean, in the case of Keller, we had 4 people die in 1 year. Obviously, construction's a very dangerous business. But so we said, right, we're going to visit now. And we visited India. And as a consequence of visiting India, we said we'd set up a special board committee on health and safety for the company. That was the only way in which we as a board could really be involved in what was going on and know what was going on in a very important aspect of one's business. I mean, construction is health and safety. I mean, you've got people dying. I mean, it's a serious business.
Yeah, it reminds me of a chair who once advised me to the importance of getting around the executive narrative and not just to accept the bird's eye view, but to push for the worm's eye view, which is what you're
Absolutely
advocating there. Can we talk about board culture, which I think you have argued is the essence of avoiding these disasters, but it's a very difficult thing to define. Can you explain how you see board culture and how those listening to this can think about measuring theirs?
I'm just going to give one example, really, of some of the problems and issues involved, particularly if you are wanting to become a global business. Because you want to become a global business, then what's a global culture? And the company I'm going to talk about is Quintiles, because Quintiles was founded in the US by a good friend who subsequently invited me to chair the audit committee. and then subsequently to chair the MEA for quintiles. And the issue we had quite simply was this, and it often happens with businesses which are based in the US, is that the people working there, which have come from a North American background, expect a culture around the world to be similar to theirs. And the fact of the matter is, it is not, because as we know, every culture, every country around the world is a different culture. And one of the issues I faced with the company was simply this. They would, for example, say that they wanted to introduce a new IT system, for example, that would be global. They wanted to introduce a new system of remuneration, or they wanted to introduce a new system of quality management, or whatever. And they would be of the opinion that it had to be the same everywhere around the world. And most of my time chairing MEA was spent almost defending what was going on in Europe, to say, look, what you're talking about is fine for the US, but it doesn't work here. It doesn't work here. And therefore, you're going to have to change and adapt the culture of the organisation to become more understanding of the fact that we're in a global business, and you have to be sensitive to those differences. And even in Europe, I mean, we all know the French are very different to the Germans, who are very different to the Spanish, who are very different to the Hungarians, and so on and so forth. Add on to those complexities, the Middle East, Africa, Asia. I spent quite a lot of time involved with the Japanese business, which I already mentioned. And so I think that the issue of culture does not get much attention, partly because it's too difficult. It's too difficult. And yet it has such a big impact on the business and the way in which it's performing. In the case of Printals, if we had just allowed, if you like, I would say allowed the guys in the US to dictate what was going to happen everywhere, we would never have been as successful as we were. We became highly successful. Part of the reason for that was that we, I would say, empowered local businesses to have the freedom to develop their business in the way that reflected the local market.
Can you maybe give me an example of where you have faced cultural dysfunction in a board and how you went about addressing that? Because I'm still wrestling with how to even define this board culture.
I mentioned data on tech, IT business, and clearly the culture there was these two guys wanted to run it as if it was still running as a private company. And that was it. That was in direct contradiction with the fact that they had become a listed company with, obviously, with all the rules requiring governance, which are in the combined code. And we can ignore all that. That's all irrelevant. We're only concerned with one thing, which is how can we make more profit. Investors were irrelevant because these guys were still running the business as if they still owned it. We went into the marketplace to find an extremely experienced chair who'd been used to moving businesses from being startups to becoming listed companies. He had all of that experience. And he was also a tough guy. Once he joined the business, then we were able to remove these two guys. We removed them. That's what we did.
Okay, so changing personnel was your approach.
Well, I think you have to do that.
Because you don't believe you can change the culture of people?
No. Very difficult. These two guys, I mean, they've been used to running their own private business. They were not about to change.
Because I've sometimes been suckered into that one, thinking that we as a board could change the executive who exhibited certain sort of cultural shortfalls, should we say. And that has always been my lesson, that the leopard does not change its spots.
No.
Is that yours too?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's not that I don't believe in director education. I'm a very strong believer in it. It's not that I don't believe that you can actually influence people. I believe that very strongly, but it's all to do with the leadership, really, and the style of the leadership that you have. People don't really change their style of leadership.
Have there been times when you've not been able to resolve cultural dysfunction in a boardroom?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say very recently. I mean, I chair a private equity fund. We've had a managing partner, I would say, who wanted to run the fund more in his interest and the interest of the managing partners, rather than the interest of the investors. And that's very difficult to deal with, extremely difficult to deal with. But we've dealt with it because at the end of the day, we persuaded him to go, but that was not easy. That was very difficult.
How on earth do you do that? Because presumably he was a sort of control shareholder.
That's right.
And so, because that's a regular challenge that comes up in our masterminds where people have that, effectively they're a subordinated board because they've got the sort of control shareholder as the executive. How did you manage to get them to leave?
With difficulty, I would say.
Okay, but what would you be for someone listening to this who says, Gerry, I've got that problem with my board. What would you advise? What's the strategy I should think about using there? What were your...
Well, I think you have to ring fence the guy, really, to get the other managing partners on your side, and also to have the investors really behind you, what you're trying to do. So you've got to have the investors, you've got to have the other members of the executive team, almost, you would describe it as ganging up on this one guy, so that over time he begins to see the writing on the wall.
When you say the investors, in that case, do you mean his LPs who are investing in the fund?
That's right.
Wow, okay.
And that's not easy.
No.
That's not easy. But anyway, we've got there.
Gosh, but that was you as chair, because I think as an independent director, that is nigh on impossible to do.
Yes, as me as chair, and I don't think it could have been. And obviously, you have to have the investor support to do that as well. And also, you have to have the credibility, I think, with the rest of the executive team. And we actually removed some of the other founders. This guy founded the fund, and over time, we'd removed two other founding partners. So he was on his own, and they're the other member, the other partners. We've got them, shall we say, to see the way things needed to change. And anyway, we got there in the end, but it took quite a long time.
You say getting the right directors is key to culture. I'm really interested to hear how you think about assessing independent directors as a chair. You listed 23 selection criteria, a combination of personal characteristics, professional and managerial competencies, and entrepreneurial competencies that should be assessed. For someone listening to this, can you bring those to life and how you use them?
I'll just pick a few examples. The cultural flexibility one, to me, you can get the personal characteristics here. The example I would give is Van, which this was a business that was the first management buyout in Japan by 3i. And I would say finding the right person to bring onto that board was extremely important, and I'll explain why. 3i didn't really send any of their investment team to Japan very often. They kind of relied upon me because I was a representative of 3i. But the chairman, we used to get pretty fed up with this because he'd say, look, these people have invested 90 million and you never see them. He and I got on very well because he played golf and I played golf. And so he'd invite me to play golf in Japan, and he'd invite me to go and see sumo wrestling and all the rest of it. So I got to know quite a lot about Japan and what was needed. But what was needed to do really was a Japanese person with international experience. And we scoured the world with a headhunter, of course, to find the right person to bring on to the board. And we did that. And it worked very well. But, finding the right person in that particular case had to have, the cultural dimension was so important because it's a Japanese company. Originally, the board meetings they were in English. And once the company what happened was that 3i were bought out by Nishihu, the biggest bank in Japan, and I continued to represent them. But then the board meetings were in Japanese. Everything was in Japanese. I don't speak Japanese. So. Anyway, that's an example of the personal one.
What about something like integrity, which is one of the things that you have in there as a key criteria? And I always think that's such a difficult one because you're never going to get someone who says, well, actually, I'm not a high integrity person. So how are you assessing for that?
You have to try and get to know the person before you take them on. I mean, clearly, if there are people who they use you as a reference, who you know or you can follow up with, but often if you don't know the reference, then you might just get platitudes. So that's not so easy then to assess whether or not that person has got integrity. I think the best thing you can do is to look at the track record that they have in business and the problem and issues they've had to deal with and how they've dealt with them. To me, would be the way to really get to the bottom of integrity.
That dovetails very nicely with actually the thoughts of Jeff Smart, who's another past Enter the Boardroom guest, who argues that people should be doing forensic analysis of the individual's past record to identify their patterns of behavior and modes of operating. And I guess you would expect to see something like integrity come up through that. And the same with things like judgment or interpersonal sensitivity. So it's very much a sort of backwards looking assessment you would be doing rather than a situational type assessment where you're asking them how would you behave in such a situation. Gerry, before we go on to the lightning round, because time is flying by, I just want to quickly touch on your director's checklist, which you helpfully include in Disasters in the Boardroom in the back. And there was one of the questions in there was, do individual directors undertake continuing professional development? Really curious to hear, what professional development do you do?
The reason that I continue to go to seminars and join in whatever podcast or whatever is because I always find that I'll learn from other people about the challenges they're facing or whatever. And some things are pretty obvious. If you take the whole issue, shall we say, of AI, which all of us are seeking to come to terms with, what does this mean to, as part of one's professional development, I have to take the opportunities that I can to understand and learn more about what this is going to mean in terms of the businesses that I'm involved with. The other thing that I do is I go to conferences. There's a conference, for example, of the great and the good of private equity, held once a year. People from all over the world go to that. I then go to a pharma, the FT runs a pharma conference, which I go to. The other thing is that I take the opportunity, if I'm invited to speak, which I am by the FT or any business school or whatever, I usually say yes because, it's the questions that people ask, which you hadn't thought about before. And suddenly, you're on the spot. You've got to think about that. So I think taking those kind of opportunities really, and I do read quite a lot. And I know you've asked me to identify a book, which I have. But for example, I'm in my study and I'm looking at a book which I read about. It's called Judgment at Tokyo. And whenever I visited Japan, one of the big issues was understanding their whole attitude about the Second World War and what that meant to them and so on. I could never, ever get them to even talk about that. And I never understood why until I read this book, Judgment at Tokyo, and realised that when the trials were carried out after the Second World War, they had 12 different judges come from all over the world. And they all had different opinions, and many of them thought that Japan was defending Asia in what they did. And also that, the bombing of Hiroshima and so on was far the worst thing that ever happened, and that was done by the Americans. I only give that as an example of, shall we say, seeking to understand what's going on in an individual country is obviously important.
Books are the weights of the mind, as Epictetus said. Gerry, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Yeah, just let me find these questions if I can.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
Plunder, which is private equity's plan to pillage America, by Brendan Ballou.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
Arrogance and verbosity.
Most valuable board ritual?
Visiting operations.
Favourite quote?
The London Business School has got a motto, and it says, if you think training is expensive, try ignorance.
best professional advice you've ever received?
Most business situations are grey. They're not black or white.
What have you changed your mind about regarding boards over time?
I've always thought that board education was important, but as time's gone on, I realised it's much more important than I thought originally.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
Well, it's 4 years ago, and I mentioned the story to you of the managing partner, the fund, and I should have taken action to remove him earlier.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I listen and learn more now.
And finally, 3 takeaways our listeners should take from this podcast if they remember nothing else.
The consequences of board scandals are enormous. We have enough rules about regulating companies. It's behaviour that counts. And most scandals are avoidable. And there is a checklist in the book that shows you how they can be avoided.
Gerry, the breadth and depth of your experience is quite mind-blowing. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
You are very welcome, Oliver. It's been a great pleasure to take part. I think all the work you're doing with the variety of people from business that you're getting insights from is extremely valuable for board members. So please keep up the good work.
Building a non-exec career is hard. For those starting out, boards can be opaque. For more experienced board members, it can be lonely and hard to stay match fit. Having placed almost 4,000 people on boards in the last 5 years, we know what success looks like. It requires time, energy, resilience, information, and connections. New Role Plus, our community of board peers, exists to give you these things, offering you wholesale support as you try to get board roles and become a standout NED. Find out more at newrole.com/newrole-plus. That's newrole.com/newrole-plus.